as different features, vectors, and other capabilities emerged, with hopes of understanding how this could relate back to IoT. And we actually selected a few pieces of malware from these categories that we're going to talk about in the next few slides. So the first, and kind of my favorite because of the names, are the Creeper and the Reaper. The Creeper is the first self-replicating malware, and it was created as an experiment, and it resulted in actually the first nematode. And for those of you who do not know what a nematode is, I dare you to Google it, and the images will not be very, very welcoming. You would not want to see those. I found out the hard way that a nematode is a worm or a piece of malware that's actually created to combat another worm or virus, malware. And that's exactly what the Reaper did. It replicated itself through ARPANET and actually deleted the files that the Creeper used. Now, the importance of this, and the reason why we mentioned it here, is that it introduced a capability that was actually used by a plethora of malware to date, and that was self-replication. No, it actually wasn't malicious in nature. It was an experiment. It was a proof of concept, but it led to variants of viruses and malware that actually utilized this technique. So this actually was malicious in nature. It is the brain virus. It conquered many firsts. It was the first IBM PC virus, the first boot sector virus, as well as the first full stealth virus. And for those of you who ever had to boot off a floppy disk, my co-presenter here has. I personally haven't, so I've only heard stories about this. But what happens with this virus is that it would install itself into memory at boot, and it would actually infect every floppy disk that was accessed while it was still in memory. And while it infected these floppies, it would actually move the original boot sector to a separate sector, and it marked it as bad, and infect the used sector with the virus. And it incorporated itself because it actually would redirect to that sector marked as bad where the boot sector was if ever the infected sectors were attempted to be accessed. So besides being the first IBM PC virus, which is very significant, this actually introduced boot sector infection and boot sector spreading. Next, the Concept. Concept was the first macrovirus seen in the wild, and a macrovirus. I don't know if, I'm sure everyone knows what a macrovirus is here, but just to be safe, a macrovirus is a virus that utilizes a macro language in order to exploit its target. And that's exactly what this did. It would actually open a document, or when a document was opened that was infected, it would traverse through the template in search of any of its macros, and if those were not present, it would continue to infect that template. And it would spread by infecting every document saved on that machine. So as the name kind of alludes to, Concept was a proof of concept, but it led to variants that utilize this technique. And if you guys have ever seen the macros disabled prompt when you open a Windows document or a Microsoft document, this is the reason why. They actually implemented that as a defense against these macroviruses.
So I need to lower the mic here a bit because I'm clearly not as tall as my colleague Blaine. I also will stand off to the side so you can actually see me. The blaster worm is a classic example of a worm. Blaster is noted in 2003, came out and very rapidly spread across the internet. People were sufficiently connected at the time that there was a target-rich environment, for lack of a better term. It exploited a buffer overrun. Now, the interesting thing about this was the buffer overrun had a patch for it. The patch was actually released a month before the first sighting of this virus. Later, what was discovered is that the authors of this virus actually reverse engineered that patch to find the buffer overrun, and then wrote the virus using that. So because patches were not applied in a timely manner, all those machines got hit by Blaster, and it was a lot of machines. Coming a little bit more modern malware, we get into the area of APTs. APTs are advanced persistent threats. Probably the most famous one is Stuxnet. Stuxnet is a piece of malware that was designed to target ICS SCADA systems. Now, and not only all ICS SCADA systems, but it needed a particular PLC, a Siemens unit that's displayed there, or one other type of unit, and it had to have a certain number of motor driver cards in it, and it had to be certain models of those cards. It was a very targeted piece of malware. It would not run on PLCs that did not match this configuration. It was very stealthy. It's also noted that, for whatever reason, people believed by 2010 that air gaps were protection against this. As my colleague Blaine pointed out, in 1986, when people were using floppies, the way viruses were moved around was across air gaps. You know, for the people that did that, you know, at most you had a modem, you'd dial up to, you know, some BBS, but most people didn't in 86. So it was jumping air gaps all the time. Why people were surprised that it, you know, what was it, in 2010, malware could still jump an air gap? I don't know. Maybe they just got used to all the worms. So it was reported that at least 1,000 centrifuges were destroyed. And it was interesting how this malware worked. It actually installed itself in between the PLC and what's called the HMI, or the human-machine interface. And every time the HMI was used to read back the section of code involving these motor speeds, it would return the original code, not the actual code that was running, which was a piece of malware. And this brings us to today, or at least to the middle of last year, when the Mirai malware was first seen in the wild. Mirai is notable because it affected IoT devices. It created a botnet of IoT devices that were used in DDoS attacks, and it exploited common credentials. There were, I think, 62 combinations of usernames and passwords that it exploited. And you had to have a certain versions of Linux running on the device, and it had to have certain utilities available. And we'll get more into the details of this malware in later slides. But its claim to fame was that it broke records for the amount of traffic that was generated. At one point, it was streaming 1.2 terabits per second against a DNS provider. So that was 4 times what was seen before Mirai. So when Blaine and I were looking at this malware, we noticed a couple trends. And so we identified some trends that we wanted to talk about. Because, yes, Mirai is affecting IoT, but, and I guess Stuxnet is also industrial IoT. But a lot of these other things were very much PC-focused or server-focused. So we wanted to learn the lessons from them, because those weren't going to be running on the IoT. What lessons can we learn and apply to what we expect to see? So the first is evasion. Malware has evolved over time to avoid detection by anti-malware tools, and also to defend itself against malware researchers. You know, there's polymorphic viruses. We'll get into some of these things where they actually take the code, it's encrypted, and the unpacker, which is the initial portion of the code that runs, will change over time, but still be able to uncrypt and re-encrypt every time the malware spreads. So this was something that was developed in order to defeat signature-based anti-malware. Another really interesting one that we'll get into in a little bit is Blue Pill. So this was a research project that actually installed a hypervisor shim under the normal operating system on the machine, ran the guest OS in one VM and the malware in another. One of the issues with anti-malware tools is they tend to be reactive. It's sort of hard to anticipate what the next new technique is going to be and write your anti-malware, antivirus software so that it's one step ahead of the malware authors discovering the technique. So thanks to Lustine Labs, I was able to borrow this slide from one of their presentations. This is just 1 year of what they captured in a set of their honeypots. You see at the beginning there were a little over 30% of all the samples of malware caught were using, at this point, very advanced evasive techniques. By the end of the year, it was closer to 80–90%. And this trend has continued along those lines so that right now almost all malware that is successful is using evasive techniques. One of the most famous pieces of malware was the Morris worm in 1988. I was in college at the time and running a machine that was not a Sun 3 or a VAX. It was actually a micro PDP-11 running a different version of Unix, so I was not affected. But a lot of the other machines in our labs got slammed with the Morris worm. The Morris worm spread only on VAXs and these Sun 3 workstations. There were particular versions of operating systems they needed, but the evasive techniques that it used was that it would do a variety of different things, such as constantly starting and stopping itself so the process IDs would change. This allowed for any system administrators that were monitoring, they wouldn't see that you had one process consuming all their CPU. So it was hiding from people using TOP or other utilities similar to that to look for excessive computation use. They configured the binary so that when it was loaded, it prevented core dumps from being written. So that if you sent a kill signal or there was a bug in it, it wouldn't dump core, and you couldn't have anything there to look at to try and figure out what was going on. And it also did encryption of data and strings. So if you'd run the Unix strings command against it, it wouldn't find any human-readable strings because this was all encrypted. Again, this piece of malware exploited buffer overruns in a variety of different codes. And we'll see that buffer overruns are another one of these techniques that are very, very common with malware. Polymorphic malware is something I mentioned earlier. The first known example of that is 1260, written by Washburn, is a research project in 1990, and it introduced the idea where the bulk of the malware was encrypted, and then it would rearrange and add no-ops and other things into the unpacker so that the length of the unpacker changed constantly. This was a technique used to defeat this static signature-based antivirus. It was very effective at preventing those static signatures from being used. Dark Avenger mutation engine is also interesting because it was the first toolkit designed to actually help people write polymorphic viruses. Polymorphic viruses are not necessarily easy to write. But thanks to Dark Avenger and Marburg, there's toolkits available that make it easy to write. Very high level stuff so that you didn't have to know all the little ways to rearrange the assembly to make it work. Yep. So I know that in the 80s, antivirus software was available. Trying to think, I know by 86, the vaccine program was available. It was probably a little bit earlier than that. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head. But early to mid-80s. Marburg, again, was a mutation system. It was both a virus and an engine. And it was very sophisticated and well-written. By this point, Marburg was written by professional developers, professional malware developers that were selling their toolkits to make money. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the next section on motivation. So I mentioned Blue Pill for a little bit. Blue Pill is a really interesting piece of malware. Joanna Rutkowska, I hope I pronounced her last name correctly, is a Polish cybersecurity researcher and entrepreneur. And she wrote a paper and developed a program called Blue Pill in 2006. So what Blue Pill did is it inserted a very thin hypervisor between the operating system that was supposed to run on the machine and the actual operating system. And it required some specific hardware at the time because it used hardware virtualization to do this. But once that hypervisor was in there, it ran in parallel a malicious service that used APIs provided by the hypervisor to attack software running in the guest OS. Think about that. You could have any sort of tool looking for malware either in memory or on disk on your target OS, and there was no way for you to see the malicious software, no way to see the malware, because it was isolated with in a different VM. She then went on to develop a technique against this called Red Pill that we'll talk about in a little bit. Hopefully everybody here has seen The Matrix. Blue Pill, Red Pill came from that. Again, bringing us much closer to today, I'm going to talk about another piece of malware. It was experimental, written by Ronen, O'Flynn, Shamir, and Weingarten. I got a preprint of it in October. 80 Shamir said at RSA earlier this month that it's going to be, the published version is going to be coming out shortly. But the paper is entitled IoT Goes Nuclear, Creating a Zigbee Chain Reaction. Now this is a really interesting project that they did. What they did is they took some light bulbs, smart light bulbs. Now we're actually getting into our IoT here. And these light bulbs communicated with a hub via Zigbee EPL. I think that's the electric, or ELP, the electric lighting profile. They were able to disconnect the bulbs from the hub, get a bulb to act as a personal area network controller, a PAN controller for Zigbee, and then break the connections on bulbs within a certain distance of the infected bulb. It then had the capability to overwrite the firmware in those other bulbs, and they would go on to do that, so on and so on and so on. Okay, they actually put in there some work in their paper to actually estimate how many bulbs would need to be infected in order to have a chain reaction go off and affect every bulb in a city the size of Paris. They also built an embedded system to spread this virus that they stuck onto a drone and flew around a building that they had set up a number of these in to start chain reactions in the building. It's an excellent paper. Recommend, if you're really into this stuff, that you read that. But the important thing here is to realize it's bypassing your traditional IP network. You know, your Wi-Fi network, wired network, it doesn't matter how that hub is connecting to the internet. This piece of malware, this worm, never travels on the internet. It goes from bulb to bulb, completely avoiding firewalls, antivirus software running on your PCs, even anti-malware tools that might be added to a hub. So the devices themselves now are spreading through an IoT wireless protocol. It's important because this is the future. So I'm going to go in a little bit on detection techniques, just so that we can be on a common ground in terms of what we're talking about with language and give you an idea of how malware evades. So there's basically two different techniques, dynamic and static. Static takes a look at the binary image and either does some sort of signature matching, or it does some decompilation of that, then either does signature matching against a higher level abstraction, or when security researchers are looking at malware, they do the decompilation. That would be static detection and analysis. Dynamic detection and analysis is looking at running malware. One of the common techniques is sandboxing. It's now with containers and other things, you can run every single application in a different sandbox, in a different container, have them isolated. One of them can get infected with malware, and it doesn't affect the rest of the system. This is also a common technique used by researchers to look at the malware. You can actually, attach a debugger to running malware and step through the code. Programming focused is where, again, that's that technique where I said you were going to attach a debugger. That's really a program focused. You normally do it in a sandbox because if you mess it up, you don't want to infect all the rest of your systems. And API call monitoring is another technique that's used. So you look for patterns in the operating system calls that are anomalous. You may also be looking at various different parameters passed into those function calls. So by monitoring what the software is doing at the system level, you can see, is it trying to write files into a secure area? Is it, sending these very long strings into a function to try and exploit a buffer overrun, etc. So, how do you evade this type, or how does malware currently evade? So for signature, there's polymorphic, which we talked about, metamorphic, where the malware rearranges actually even the executable parts of it, as well as any sort of packer, unpacker code. And patching. Now, patching is a technique where you'll have a loader come on, and then after the loader is running, it'll go out and download patches to itself, effectively, that contain the actual payload. Mirai actually does this. It downloads different code based upon the platform that it's running on, so that if it's running on a MIPS-based device versus an ARM-based device, it would download different images. The other technique I mentioned for static was decompilation. I mentioned the idea of this packers. Anti-linear and anti-taint are two other classes of malware evasion. For example, an idea of anti-linear would be the actual image is misaligned in memory, so that if you try to run some sort of analysis on it try to decompile it, it's not going to make sense because, let's say, your processor expects everything on 32-bit boundaries, but you have stuff all over the place. Then there's a little stub code at the beginning that rearranges where everything's laid out in memory once it loads, so all the instructions actually are aligned properly and the code can execute. Dynamic functions are functions created during runtime that actually contain the malware. Anti-taint is sort of interesting. I'm going to talk spaghetti code is probably easiest way to understand this. When people talk about spaghetti code, if you're a software developer, they said, oh, that's a bunch of spaghetti code. You just did a bad thing. Everybody said, no, 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 you don't want to write spaghetti code. No one can understand your spaghetti code, okay? Well, if a malware researcher wants to understand what's going on, and your malware is spaghetti code, they're going to have a tough time following the logic. So there are obfuscation techniques that are intentionally put in place to make the code really bad from a human readable point of view. And that means that your malware researchers can't understand easily what the code does. When we get into dynamic, there's a couple of different techniques. One of them is system-based, as I mentioned, sandboxing. Red pill, I'd mentioned earlier. I guess strictly speaking, red pill should be under VM detection. And what this does is it will have some code that tries to determine whether it's running on bare metal native hardware or whether it's in some sort of sandbox or VM. And based upon that, it'll act differently. So a classic way of doing this is to have a timing loop. And if it takes too long, it will branch off into innocuous code. So if you're running in a VM that does any sort of slowdown on it, because maybe it's software emulation, or you have a debugger attached, this is going to detect that, and then the code stops its malicious activity. So how many people here are familiar with file formats of executables, like ELF or that? Okay, so you're familiar then probably with what the text section is. The text section in an executable is where the code actually is located. Well, dynamic text sections have just a little loader stub in their text. And maybe in the data section is where the actual malware exists. So it'll load up, it'll check to see whether or not it's in a sandbox environment, and then if it isn't, it will rearrange the file, reload it, so now the data section that was text, real executable code, now becomes the, okay. Sorry about that. The data section, which contains the code, is now the text section and can actually execute and perform malicious behavior. Program-oriented evasion. Again, there's various different anti-debug traps. This timing loop is an example. You can also set up breakpoint catchers, so that if there's breakpoints set by a debugger, they won't be caught and it'll run past the code so that you can't do dynamic analysis. And then in terms of the API monitor, the idea is that you can check the system, you can do probes and determine if the conditions are right for you to run your malicious code. And if it's not right, then it waits, spreads, it doesn't do anything. It behaves as if it were some benign piece of software. With that, I'm going to turn over to my colleague Blaine, who's going to talk about some of the motivation behind this malware.
All right, so I think it's safe to say that most malware is created with a general purpose, whether that be trying to understand if things are possible, destroying things or whatnot. And we have attempted to kind of identify 4 categories, or general categories, that fall under these likely motives. And this is because we feel that motive plays a very significant role on how malware is designed, how it's used. So to understand that would help us relate this back to IoT targeted malware. So these are the categories that we've identified. These are very general categories. If anyone has ever taken maybe a psychology to cybercrime sort class, this may sound familiar. But we've kind of seen a trend and pattern that malware kind of starts off as a proof of concept, and it moves down to destructive and destruction. It causes havoc and actual harm. And then it falls into profit and cyber operations. So the first motive, proof of concept, in the past was largely seen to be authored by hobbyists and researchers who were trying to prove that something that was a theorized action was actually possible. And as seen in the past, these have been very harmless and very visual, unless harm or stealth was something that the author was attempting to prove was capability. So, as mentioned earlier, The Creeper was actually authored by Bob Thomas, and this was an experiment. It kind of coincides with our understanding of how proof of concepts are designed. It displayed this message that I'm the creeper, catch me if you can, and if that appeared on your system, you were infected. So originally, Bob Thomas actually designed this to infect the machine, print this file, and then transfer itself over. And the author of The Reaper actually redesigned this and edited it to allow the malware to replicate itself versus just transferring. I think it's safe to say that this is not really destructive and just is more of an annoyance. But as I said earlier, this introduced danger and opened the door to authors using this type of technique. So once the ladders have been tested, you kind of see that malware and its authors are kind of moving into a destructive motive and intent. What they want to do is actually, alter data, configure settings, and actually cause harm to their target. And it's no longer, a friendly, I'm the creeper, catch me if you can message on your screen. It's more, I'm going to destroy your target, destroy your machine. So typically what happens is that the creators of these type of malware actually adopt methods and techniques that are proven with bioproof of concept and kind of refine them so that they're more malicious. So an example of that is the CIH virus. It's also known as Chernobyl, if I'm pronouncing that correct, and Spacefare. And this actually this was a virus that attacked Microsoft Windows machines, and it completely wiped your flash ROM BIOS content. And the behavior is that this actually would infect every executable that it could once it was executed. And it was stealthy in that it kind of inserted itself into segments of the segments of code that hadn't been used, so the length of the file never changed. And it resulted in a lot of damage. I bet it was about in the millions. Nowadays, it's safe to say that malware authors are largely motivated by profit and personal gain. And some examples of this are actually extortion and paid employment. So extortion, when you think of ransomware and encrypting data, and paid employment being that some cyber criminal groups are actually paid to author code for others. So typically these are designed to actually be stealthy and not cause destruction on their host machine, unless that was the purpose or unless it got to that point. So say if you didn't pay the ransomware, or you didn't pay the ransom for your ransomware, you would lose your data. So an example of a piece of malware that was actually driven by profit is Mirai. Surprisingly enough, I actually thought it was cyber operations. I read a few articles online that said it was believed to be a nation-state actor. But there was a recent article that was published by, I believe, Curbs on Security, that actually uncovered that the author did this for monetary gain. So, as Mark had mentioned, it exploited poorly designed IoT devices, and it was used to actually target these internet resources. The thing about this is it is actually derived from a family of IoT botnets that date, I think, about 3 years back. And these botnets were actually used to take down Minecraft servers of their competitors. And so that's how it was established that ultimately this came from a profit-motivated intent. So this is also a common mode of cyber operations, and it can be broken into kind of two sections, and that's espionage and attacks. So this is kind of comparable to a destructive motive with the fact that it is causing damage at some points, but it is actually very targeted, as Mark had mentioned with Stuxnet. Stuxnet actually was developed by nation-state actors, and they were targeting Iran's nuclear program, and it was believed that they were this was deployed to set back their progress. Now, it actually forced changes in the centrifuge rotary speed, and it actually caused those to be damaged. And as Mark said earlier, it resulted in 1,000 damaged centrifuges. So tying that back to IoT, there are very obvious benefits of IoT. I personally enjoy the use of IoT devices. It's very convenient. It improves the quality of life. That cannot be denied, but what can't be ignored is the drawbacks that are associated with IoT. For one, interconnectivity. It serves as an entry point to a system or to a home, as Mark had mentioned with the IoT room. And obviously these lack built-in security. And at times there is dissipating vendor support. So I, as a vendor, could put out a product that I'm no longer creating firmware upgrades for or patching, and that leaves vulnerabilities in your system. And lastly, it results in insecure IoT systems because you could have old IoT devices that you've created a system for, and these actually are a systems of systems if you think about it and how they operate. And the saying that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link applies here, in that it serves for vulnerabilities. So the major difference between the platforms of the past and the IoT platform is the physical impact of the IoT devices and what they do physically. So to put that in context, imagine your thermostat is attacked with a ransomware, and it is set to the coldest temperature during winter time. So not only are you really cold and you can't stay in your house, you leave your home, and now pipes burst because your home isn't heated, and that results in actual physical damage. And there are other annoyances that this could cause. Say your smart TV has ransomware on it as well. You can't watch TV. It's unfortunate that can occur. So what we've seen to date is that IoT-targeted malware has surprisingly progressed through all categories of motive very quickly, and there's little resistance. And I think it's safe to say that this is because the authors of IoT malware kind of had it easy because history did all the hard part for them. I mean, they're not coming up with very new techniques. These are things we've seen in the past. It's just there's a lack of security with these devices. Kill disk is actually it's a piece of malware that I'm sorry, it's eluding me. I can't remember exactly what it was. Yeah, I know it was in Ukraine. Yeah.
I'm not sure. Was that the one that?
So, eventually, I think it's safe to say that we will see a combative conflict between, IoT malware authors and hopefully anti-malware authors, and it's assumed that evasive IoT malware will only be deployed when needed. Malware has kind of become a business, and you want to do as little as you can to get what you need. And right now with IoT devices, there is very little to stop IoT targeted malware. I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
I should have gotten a chair or a stool to stand on here, so I didn't have to keep moving this back up. So, I'm going to make a prediction, and I feel fairly safe in making this prediction. Malware will continue to evade anti-malware. I mean, it's always happened. It's evolution. You get some sort of technique put in place to defend against the current crop of techniques. People are very resourceful and will find ways around them, especially nation-state cyber operations and profit-driven criminal organizations. What does that mean for the IoT? It means we can expect malware will always be attacking and infecting IoT. So what do we do? Well, we can play whack-a-mole and keep going, trying to come up with a solution for the next new technique that's discovered. However, as I mentioned earlier, anti-malware tends to be reactive. You're not going to start developing anti-malware for techniques that are not in use. Again, the anti-malware vendors are companies that are profit-driven. So they're going to develop software that meets the current needs, not some anticipated future need of some malware that has not been written. So we learn to live with malware and IoT. Harm reduction. So right now we have this sort of model where we're trying to defend our systems and keep them in a pristine state, keep them from getting infected. But infections happen. And as you get 20 billion devices, they're going to happen a lot. And even if they're not happening today, the fridge, the smart fridge that you buy next year, in 5 years, any code running on it to protect against today's malware will not be effective. And in 15 years, is the manufacturer still releasing patches for your fridge? I don't know. I doubt it. So, can we limit the damage that's caused by malware? Microsegmentation. This idea, even with sandboxing, where, in containers in particular, where every single application runs in a different environment, you're limiting the harm that a malware infection can cause. There may be physical ways to reduce the harm. So in the case of a centrifuge that is having its motor speed changed constantly, if you have a big heavy flywheel with lots of inertia, it may take more energy to get the thing started, but the speed of the rotor is not going to rapidly change, and your ceramic blades are not going to crack and go flying and cut through the rest of your equipment. So, one of the things to look at is what happens post-exploit. So who here is familiar with the cyber kill chain developed by Lockheed Martin? So the blue arrow over there on the screen, that's the cyber kill chain. You see exploit in the middle, you have control, execute, and maintain as the 3 stages after it. If you go to attack.miter.org, you'll find a catalog. It's actually a wiki, and you can submit samples to it, where it talks about the actual techniques that are used. So how do malware on Windows, and it's focused on Windows right now, maintain presence? How is lateral movement accomplished? How are command and control done? So if we can disrupt these things, we can make the malware less effective. We don't necessarily have to prevent the infection if we can stop one of these things later on. Because the whole idea of the cyber kill chain is you need to do all 7 in order to actually do damage. Give you an example of this. Think about, you have, I mentioned microsegmentation where you're preventing lateral movement. Another idea would be to have multiple devices actually working in concert. And if one of them is infected, it doesn't bring down the whole system. I don't know how many people are aware of the way the computers in the space shuttle work, but there are 3 on independent hardware running software developed by 3 independent groups, and the system's voted. In theory, if the shuttle got infected by malware, if it was still flying, if the shuttle got infected by malware and one of those implementations was taken out, it could still function fine with the other 2. Okay, so I stand corrected there, but the idea is that why did they do this? They made it more resilient. Okay, so in this case, the resiliency was not really for malware. It was for damage to the hardware. Okay? Why aren't we developing our software and our systems and our devices to be resilient? Okay? Do you want only one way to stop your car? You have an emergency brake in addition to the main brakes, and you have 4 brakes, 1 on each wheel, hopefully. You had a comment? Yeah, the minimally viable product. Okay, that's the consumer IoT. You need to get your features out. You need to get the product onto the market, because the longer you take, the smaller market share you're going to make, the less profit you make. But that's a device, not a system. Okay? When you put together systems, the idea is that the system is resilient. You can lose a device and still have it function. If you have a security camera system, you can lose a camera and still be able to have, observation of most of your system in most of your area. Maybe you have overlapping cameras, so even the loss of a single camera doesn't affect you. We need to start thinking about developing these systems in resilient ways. No, what I'm saying is we need to develop secure systems using insecure devices and code. The malware will always get on the device. It will be insecure. If it isn't insecure today, it will be in 5 years. We need to build the systems to be resilient, not the devices. It'd be great if we build the devices to be secure and resilient too. That's, nirvana. But, what we need is the system to perform a job. Maybe it performs it more slowly or not as well as if everything was operational. But the system needs to be functional in the face of failure and attack. Yeah, so, I didn't develop the cyber kill chain. Lockheed Martin developed that. I actually spoke with one of the developers the other week. But the idea stands, and I agree with you. If we can have anti-fragile systems, that's a type of resilience. I'm not saying that the systems themselves are fragile. It's made of a set of fragile components. I mean, think of your body. Your body is a complex system. You can cut yourself and damage a whole bunch of components, okay, i.e. your skin, your muscles, you can break bones. Over time, those broken components are fixed and replaced. So the system remains resilient. That's what we need, especially in our critical infrastructure, okay? A cyber immune system. Okay, that's one thing, but that's not all I'm talking about with the resilience. I mean, there's a whole, field of resilience, and it's you don't have enough time this week to go into all of what we could talk about on cyber resilience. Question? So I'll give you another thing to think about. So I've talked to boards before where I'm trying to convince them, hey, you need to adopt better security practices even though you don't know that you've been a victim of this type of attack. You talk to any of your C-suite board of directors, they're not going to understand. Most of them won't understand what you're talking about. You tell them that this system is an unhedged put on the stock market, and they're going to understand that. They're going to understand there's limited upside, infinite downside, okay? Think of an automated assembly line or a partially automated assembly line. Let's pick the auto industry. What does it cost a major auto manufacturer to have one of their lines go down for an hour? Millions of dollars, okay? Now, if they have, industrial IoT, PLCs present that are not secured because, for lots of reasons they may not be secured, and you talk to them about the cost of that, of being attacked, it's going to open their eyes. So, it's business, especially at the executive level, is about managing risk. Security is about managing risk. One of the issues that we as cybersecurity engineers have to do better is we need to be able to talk in their language. We're both talking about risk, but we're trying to explain it in terms of technical things, and that's not their forte. And I think you're going to see it forced upon them by insurance. I don't know about 10 years, maybe 5. Yeah, and things have happened. There has been progress. But if you have large number of IoT devices that your business depends upon, and you get a business continuity policy to deal with the residual risk, the insurance rates are going to go up unless you're implementing good practice. And that's what I'm trying to say here. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be better. You don't have to outrun the bear, just the other person standing next to me. Sorry, Blaine.